Okay, that shocking Michael Jackson documentary, Leaving Neverland, has been a mega hit on HBO, but how will it do at the Emmys and other awards? I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby here with director Dan Reed to ask him, first of all, Dan, how have you dealt with with Jackson's defenders who have vehemently come after this film that you've made?
I think I've mostly ignored the really virulent ones who are not interested in listening to anything the film has to say, but only in telling me and Wade and James that we're liars and all the rest of it. So yeah, kind of by ignoring and by ignoring the worst of it, and then I guess sometimes engaging. You know, I was on a French chat show where they had a Jackson fan that I chatted to. But I mean, by and large, the press, I guess you call them the higher quality press, have been really have been great. And like the rating on Rotten Tomatoes is 98%. We've had a really great feedback from most of the serious press, and then the really sort of radical tabloid stuff I've ignored, to be honest.
Has any part of the retaliation to the documentary from Jackson's estate or his defenders been something that has caught you off guard or something that you were unprepared for?
Not really. I mean, we knew that they would be very upset and that they would do whatever they could to try and protect their reputation and the value of their commercial asset, which is huge. So yeah, we weren't. I don't think I was surprised. I mean, I think, you know, it's kind of been bigger, and the noise has been louder than I expected, and I didn't expect to be personally quite as exposed as I have been. Usually, as the director and the producer of a documentary, I try and stay in the background while the subjects speak for the film, because they're what usually the press is interested in. And in this case, we didn't want to over commoditize James and Wade. We didn't want to overexpose them because we didn't want them to become fodder for the media. And so I found myself answering a lot of the questions, which was amusing and unexpected. But I've enjoyed it. Actually, it's taught me a lot.
So how did you go about deciding how you wanted to structure and frame this movie? Because it's very intricately put together over a 4-hour presentation. How did you decide how you wanted to structure and frame the narrative of it?
I mean, it started out as a much broader thing. You know, we did interviews with former detectives and with a prosecutor, with people who'd been investigating Jackson in '93 and 2005. During the previous allegations of child sexual abuse. But then I realized that actually people don't really get what child sexual abuse looks like, and people didn't really get from making this film, really understand the particular way in which the seduction seems to happen. Excuse me, I'm going to just close the door here because it's a bit noisy. Police helicopters going over. So to me, this became an opportunity to allow people to take a really deep dive into the psychology of child sexual abuse and the way it happens. And that became, and then having the family members wrapped around James and Wade, and really kind of fleshing out all the different layers of the narrative and all the different characters and what became this kind of character drama. That to me turned into something that was more valuable than a more kind of general kind of OJ Made in America type thing. I thought that focusing down, the more intensely we focused, the more laser-like the focus was, the more rewarding the story was, because you really got inside Wade and James's heads and into the psychology of their relationship with Jackson, and you really begin to understand why it is that they lied to their moms, why the moms got bamboozled, why the guys didn't speak out until many years afterwards, and that's the key thing you need to understand, because otherwise it's like, well, hang on, they said this thing back then, and now they're saying a completely different thing, and that's confusing, or makes you suspect them. So I really wanted people to go on a journey, not just be presented with information, but go on a journey with these two guys and their families. And so that's why it took this very distinctive kind of ultra focused, some say one-sided shape, but it's not. In fact, it's journalistically, it's not actually one-sided. We do have a lot of the Jackson rebuttals in it. We have him, obviously, when he was alive, and his lawyers and family members, and really no one else was in the room when these kids were getting abused. So in terms of eyewitnesses to the central fact, eyewitnesses to the crime, or people who would have something pertinent to say about the sexual abuse, which is what this kind of hinges on, there is no one else. It would be meaningless to include members of the family saying what a nice guy Michael was, or people saying that he could never do this sort of thing, because pedophiles lie. And Michael Jackson lied for a long time about the nature of his love for children.
And that actually kind of segues into the question my next question is, do you feel that because this movie involves Jackson, and that's the thing, it's not about Michael Jackson, it's about the abuse that these two people went through. But do you feel that because the movie involves Jackson as a subject, that coverage of the film gets lost in the media circus that usually surrounds that?
I've been pleasantly surprised. I think that really was the fear, that it would all get like, okay, Michael Jackson, was he, wasn't he, and looking, as you say, the whole thing getting hijacked by the history of this topic. Of which there's a couple of decades worth. But I was pleasantly surprised about how seriously a lot of the press took the orientation towards child sexual abuse, and how people engaged with the fundamental, what was new about what this film brought to our culture that was new, really, I think, which is this really kind of deep dive into the psychology of child sexual abuse, and showing how children, terrible thing to say, but how children can get seduced by an adult into a sexual relationship that kind of mirrors an adult one, and of course is totally illegal and inappropriate. But for me, the press really kind of locked onto that a lot, and I had a huge amount of feedback, from journalists, but also from private individuals who wrote to me on social media, who contacted me, who wrote. I've got probably a couple of dozen handwritten letters that arrived at my office from people saying that, being grateful and saying that I'd give them a way to talk about the abuse that they'd suffered, or I'd allowed family members to finally find a way to articulate, or to find the courage to come out and say what had happened to them, either as children or, I've had some incredible messages from parents, actually, and very, very sad underlying stories of sexual abuse being uncovered thanks to the engagement with the documentary. So I feared that the documentary would be more swamped in Jackson's celebrity blah blah, but in fact, I don't think it has been. I mean, there's been a huge amount of that as well, but I think in a more thoughtful space, and certainly in the mainstream press, it's been, people have heard me when I've said it's not about Jackson, it's about these two guys and their families, which it manifestly is. I didn't wake up in the morning and say to myself, how am I going to take down Michael Jackson? I mean, that thought was never in my head. I was drawn to this film by the opportunity to create such a detailed and compelling story around child sexual abuse, and one that a lot of people will come to, because it's, about one of the most, or it involves one of the most famous entertainers who ever lived.
And one of the interesting things about this documentary is that you chose or weren't able to interview the two people who had publicly accused Jackson before, the 1993 accuser who settled out of court, and the person who brought the charges in 2005, I think it was, or 3, and then the trial was in 05.
Okay.
Yeah, and was acquitted on. Why did you either choose not to include them, or weren't able to include them?
Well, I wasn't. I mean, I tried to find Geordie, but he was unfindable, and I didn't want to. You know, I guess I could have found him, but I didn't want to like track him down like some kind of fugitive. If he clearly doesn't want to be found or contacted. And I did contact Gavin Arvizo, and I know that my message got to him, but I didn't hear back from him. And again, I wasn't going to jump on him and force him to engage with my film, or to relive all of that pain he'd been through. So those attempts to contact Geordie and Gavin and others were part of the sort of earlier phase of making this film. And then as we started putting the film together in the edit, it quickly became clear that, well, not that quickly, after I'd say 3 or 4 months, it became clear that we had something extraordinary if we just kept it focused, and that you were drawn into this amazing story, that these two families. And we wrapped it in a context that allowed you to understand what was happening and allowed you to comprehend the fact that the Jackson camp was at war against the young men who had made the accusations in '93 and 2003. But primarily, we see the whole drama through the eyes of the then little boys, who are the only people who know what really happened in that behind the locked doors of Jackson's bedroom.
So it's interesting that with this documentary, because you've done several documentaries about events that have involved major trauma being inflicted on those involved. What are some of the similarities that you have seen with Wade and James's stories and those of people who have survived trauma, stuff like terrorist attacks that have happened in Kenya, France, and Mumbai?
I mean, in each case, you have people who. It's a little bit different with James and Wade because they were so young when the abuse happened. But you have people who kind of had a normal life, and then there's this threshold event, whether it's shooting at a mall or terrorist attack, or the icon that they admire and trust suddenly crossing the line into sexual behavior. 1 minute the world is this way, and the next minute it's completely different, and your life has changed. And crossing that threshold is the moment that you want to hinge your story around, because that's you want your audience to be able to experience that, almost to live the journey up to that moment, and then the journey through and beyond that moment with the protagonist. And I think that's what I learned to do, making these other films about a different kind of trauma. But I learned to have a special regard for just creating that space around the interviewees, and really, the cinematography, really allowing their facial expressions, allowing their behavior to come through, giving that time, giving it space, lighting it in a certain way, using, two cameras to allow me to stay on their faces while, editing the dialogue. And so to have special regard for the voice, because the voice recording is like, these are stories that are told by the human voice, and the voice and every swallow and every gulp and every smack of the lips is so important in my films. I think it just gives you a kind of empathy. It brings you closer. It creates this weird kind of crop brain kind of connection with the subjects and what they're going through. We're very tactile, very sensual creatures, and so for me, the cinematography and the sound recording, really, the way we do it, and it's a very specialized way, it really amplifies the connection between the viewer and the subjects. And also, I guess, I've learned to listen. I'm a good listener, and I think the subjects sense that, and you create that connection where they're willing to trust you and to tell you what, in great detail, almost like, you focus people on a very narrow timeline, and you don't allow them to comment or to sort of bounce around and kind of change the optic. You keep them very firmly on a particular optic, and I think that pays off, because it means that the audience is kind of locked into that point of view as well, and the audience goes on that journey and is kind of sucked into the point of view and the experience of the person speaking. So I guess that's what I learned from doing all those other films. And Leaving Neverland is about two people and two families that experienced huge trauma, and have come through it. Actually, weirdly, it's not a kind of a film where you want to slash your wrist at the end. I thought it would be kind of bleak at the end, but it's curiously uplifting. Both families have kind of crawled out of that pit that they found themselves in when Wade and James disclosed, and they all realized what had happened. And I think it's kind of uplifting at the end. You see these two young men who are kind of slowly coming to terms with what happened, and then their families who are, they're still together. They have their issues, but they're still together. And they're working forward.
And that after special that aired after the second installment with Oprah Winfrey, I think really helped put everything into context.
Yeah, I agree, and that was amazing. That was incredible. That was like a godsend to have Oprah Winfrey say, I believe the guys, and also to really engage with it with so little fear, with such impact and directness. I mean, she's extraordinary. I think she's an extraordinarily it's a very inspiring person to watch and to listen to. And she had no doubt. She had no doubt whatsoever. And I think you feel that with the self-assurance with which she conducted that discussion. And also the great thing about Oprah's, and it's called After Neverland, Oprah's show, was that you got to delve into, if you like, the ideas and the concepts, and you got to analyze a little bit. Whereas my film didn't really contain sort of expert analysis, or that again, that's following my modus operandi on other films, the terrorism films, for instance, where the only people who speak in the film are the people directly involved. But with Oprah, she opened out the whole thing and brought other people in and brought experts in and really sort of wrapped the whole thing up in a framework that allowed you to interpret it. I think one stage further than the documentary.
So were there any? And I mean, the whole thing is shocking to listen to when you listen to the stories that James and Wade tell. But was there anything that you found out through the course of making this film that was insanely shocking to you, that just went beyond anything that you thought you would hear?
But when I back in February 2017, when I sat down to interview Wade, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to hear, and I kind of had a really open mind about how he was going to tell the story. But when I realized that, I remember doing this kind of double, triple take. When I realized that what Wade was telling me, that as a 7-year-old, he had been seduced and had fallen in love with Jackson. Going from admiring this stellar entertainer and idol to being very close and friendly with him, to entering into a sexual relationship with him. And I realized that, he was saying to me, Jackson wasn't violent, he wasn't brutal, he didn't force him, and this was like a sort of awful thing. It was like the beginning of an adult relationship, except that the little boy was 7 and had no idea what this meant, and could have no idea. That was really shocking. That was really shocking. More shocking than all the descriptions of the sex and all of that. And then the other thing I found really shocking was something James said, the scene he evoked where Jackson had moved on, and there was another little boy in the frame, and James had to sleep on the couch while Jackson went to his bed with the other boy, and that was really heartbreaking. The sort of emotional cruelty of that, just dropping one little child whose head you'd fill full of dreams and love and hope, and just discarding them for another. That shocked me. And I was also shocked by, I guess, how many people around Jackson must have known about this. I can't prove that anyone knew, but the people who, I mean, yeah, the mums got taken in. James and Wade's mums were taken in. Their dads were taken in as well, and allowed this to happen. But they only saw their sons, and they saw the allure of Jackson's fame and what he could offer, and they kind of thought that they were doing the best thing for their little boys. But you think of the people in Jackson's entourage who watched little boy after little boy after little boy after little boy after little boy go through this process of being wooed and showered with attention and gifts, and then invited to spend time at Neverland, and finally ending up in Jackson's bed. And you wonder, how did they interpret this? What did they think was going on in that bedroom between Jackson and the little boy? I mean, I've never actually heard anyone from the estate or the family kind of talk us through what they thought was going on in the bedroom when the lights went out.
Well, thanks, Dan, for talking with us. To all of your viewers, go to goldderby.com right now and make your predictions so that you can compete against our experts, editors, and other fans and prove if you are the smartest prognosticator in Hollywood. But before you go, click our subscribe button on this video so you're alerted to our great chats with top contenders. Thanks again, Dan.
Thanks, Charles.